Committee, and with me we have committee members Tom Duval, and we have the mayor, city auditor, fellow council people, and Paul Pry, the safety director. So we will go ahead and get started. Jeff Hallinan is not here today due to a pre-planned absence, but everyone else is here. We sent out the committee meeting minutes from April 29th, which was our last committee meeting. Tom, did you see any?
Move to submit as recorded, or move to record as submitted.
All right, I will second that. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay, so we have two items on our agenda this evening. Both are new business. Both relate to the potential possibility of a safety levy that has been discussed as a potential way to address some of the shortfalls that we have in the budget. So before we read the agenda items, I'm going to turn it over to the mayor, who has prepared a presentation, and let her speak to that, and then we'll address the items specifically on the agenda.
Thanks, Councilperson Katie Logan Hedges. I do have a presentation for this evening's for the consideration of the committee for a new an income tax levy. And so we'll just jump right in here. This 0.5 is for public safety and street improvement. So this is different than what we have seen the last couple times. So the purpose of this proposal, and I apologize if you're not able to see this, you should have a copy of this presentation in your email. It was also forwarded to the clerk for anyone in the public that would like a copy. So the purpose of this proposal is a funding explanation. So this is all of the funds that are used to fund what I am proposing this evening. The most recent income tax levy expired on December 31st of 2024. We all know that. It was in effect from January 1, 2020 until December 31st, 2024. That levy funded critical services and that need to continue to be funded. And it is our responsibility to try to figure out how to continue to provide those services to our citizens, as government is a service-based institution. And so this is to allocate revenue to fire and EMS and street infrastructure. And then this allows us to maintain safety and community quality of life through both of these projects. So this is the way that our city income tax is currently divided up. You have our general fund, that is our Fund 101, that has 81% of the original 1% income tax that all municipalities throughout the state have. It's a 1%, that's the flat. In our second one is the Capital Improvement 0.4 Income Tax Fund, Fund 206. This specifically funds street improvement, storm sewers, parks, and city lighting. In 1988, the citizens of Circleville voted for a 0.5 tax levy for operating and capital costs of safety forces. Again, in 2014, there was a safety levy that was put on with capital improvement funds. That is 216. The other piece of that is the previous 0.4. That was a 0.5 permanent levy for operating and capital costs of safety forces. And then lastly, the rest of the original 1% is funded into Fund 306. That is used for capital expenditures of all government activities. So that is the total current 2.0 income tax rate that the city has.
And so just to clarify, that's at 2%, which began of January of this year. Previous to that, for the previous 5 years, it was 2.5% because the extra 0.5% went to support safety purposes.
That's correct. So these are some numbers for you. I put them in this. These are all of the funds that I just talked about, and their yearly revenue specifically related to income tax receipts. You'll see next to that, it says total fund revenue because many of these funds have other revenue pieces that go into them other than the income tax. So like the general fund is the general fund. It has a lot of other revenue sources that go into it. Grant dollars, fees, different things like that. So you'll see, starting in 2019, the income tax receipts for the General Fund 101 was $2.672 million. The total fund for that same year was $5.676 million. And then you get all the way up to 2025 because we are only 4 months into the year. This was reflected as of May 1st of 2025. The report that was sent out by the auditor's office has our current revenue in the general fund from income tax receipts as $1.244 million. Any questions on 101? Okay, next is 206. Again, this is used for street improvements. You'll see the receipts were there of 1.297 in 2019. Total fund revenue of 1.655, all the way up to this year, current receipts of 614,000, and total revenue fund of 778,000. This was the note down at the bottom. This was part of the income tax levy that was approved by the voters in May of 2014. Safety Forces 0.5 tax fund, Fund 212. This is the income tax levy that was approved by the voters in 1988. This is where the campaign for this original levy was Citizens for a Safer Circleville when Mayor Mike Logan was mayor. And so you can see in 2024, this fund for income tax brought in $2.254 million. The total revenue for that fund was $3.209. That is about $1 million difference. And that is because Fund 212 also receives all of our EMS billing. So when our emergency squads go to take care of our citizens at their house, the revenue that comes from those services is placed into 212. Last year, that was about $880,000 that we brought in specifically from EMS billing.
And so this levy campaign in 1988 was permanent, correct?
Yes, both of the income tax levies that funded the 0.4 and the 0.1 plus this 0.5 were permanent levies. This is the second part of the 2014 levy that went towards income tax in 212 for safety forces. You'll see this one has generated anywhere between $325,000 up to $415,000. This specific income tax fund does not have any additional revenue that goes into it. This is solely income tax receipts. And all of these numbers were from revenue reports from the city's software. So I have copies of those. I can reproduce those for you to have those specific numbers. This is the Capital Improvement Fund 306. The total over the last 6 years has been anywhere between $128,000 up to $388,000. This fund did have additional revenue that went into it up until last year, and the income tax receipts was the total fund revenue.
Okay, so all of those are what make up the 2% and are permanent, existing, no
Yes.
changes to any of those.
Yep, no changes to any of those. And that is currently what these funds are what currently fund our police department and our fire department. Okay, so the most recent levy we know was from 2020 to 2024. This was Fund 227. It was passed in November of 2019. It was effective January 1. It provided critical funding for fire, EMS, and police operations. It did expire last year. We are currently operating off of reserves in our other funds to operate our safety forces. It helped maintain staffing levels, response times, and equipment. We know the voting history. In November 2023, it failed. March of 2024, it failed. And in November of 2024, it failed.
So one thing I would note about that is when it passed back in 2018, it passed considerably. It was a marketed win. When it failed in November of 2023, it was by a pretty slim margin. And every time since then, it has failed by a greater margin. So we seem to have lost some traction in that regard. If we could go back one slide though, on your bullet point number 4, when it talks about help to maintain staffing levels, can you speak to, can you quantify that at all?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
in a couple more slides.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so Fund 227, the annual revenue that was brought in specifically for this fund in 2020 was $1.256 million. In 2024, we were at $2.354 million. And so far this year, the year-to-date revenue is $399,000. We did leave some expenses in 227 to be paid for out of any carryover funds that were left in that account, plus this $399,000.
And the 399 is gathering collected income tax through 12/31 of 2024. So when will does that stop after the first quarter?
Mark has already seen a steady decline of those receipts coming into this fund.
Because at some point it will completely.
It will go away.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so 2024 expenses for fire EMS across all funds. This includes more than just the funds that we talked about earlier, where the income tax goes. Their total expenses for the year was $5.481 million. $3.811 million of that went to personnel services and benefits. It's about 70%. And then the other expenses were $1.67 million.
Can you give us an example of other expenses?
Equipment, the medical director for the EMS, other contract services, office supplies.
Would that include any grant match?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. So the city income tax funding that is proposed this evening is, again, leaving everything the same for the general fund, the 0.4 income tax, the 0.5 tax fund, the 0.1 income tax fund. And then we would, my proposal is to add 2 additional funds, one specifically for fire and EMS. The fund number is to be determined by the auditor to cover operating and capital costs of fire EMS. And then for the same, a specific fund for street improvement for construction, reconstruction, resurfacing, and repair of streets.
So to confirm, your proposal is adding what's the percent?
0.5.
0.5, and it is divided in a way that you're going to explain.
Yep.
Between street improvements.
Yep.
And the other portion being fire and EMS only.
That's correct.
Okay.
So you received the full ordinance language in your email this past weekend. And when we get to the portion of the meeting where that's read, this is just a summary of what it says. So this is to increase the tax rate by 0.5 from 2.0 to 2.5. 0.4 is allocated for fire apparatus, EMS equipment, personnel, stations, training, and related expenses per the Ohio Revised Code sections 145.48 and 742.34. That's directly from the ordinance. And then 0.1 is allocated for street, road, and bridge maintenance and repair. The ordinance directs the Pickaway County Board of Elections to place the levy on the ballot in November of 2025. It is declared emergency ordinance for timely implementation after it's passed, because by the time it is passed, it will need to go to the Board of Elections, and there is a very short time window. So staffing that was funded through the 2019 levy. So this was the 0.5 that started in 2020 and ended in 2024. It allowed the city to fund positions. These were positions that were already created by ordinance. We didn't create new positions. We simply funded these positions by allocating the 227 funds to pay for them. That included 5 police officers, 2 communications officers, and 3 firefighters.
Okay,
Again,
so can
those
we-
were funded through the levy.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can we talk about when you quantify staff and positions that it funded? Can you explain that to us, like in a shift mentality?
Yeah, so specifically for fire, because that's what we're specifically talking about, before March of 2025, each shift had 8 firefighters on a shift. 6 of those, 2 per shift, were from the SAFER grant, and I'll talk about that here in a second. The levy funded 1 person per shift. So we went from 5 people in 2019 when we didn't have the 227 funds to 6 per shift in 2020
Due to the levy.
due to the levy,
Okay.
solely due to the levy. In 2022, we changed the structure and we increased that by 6 people because of the SAFER grant that was given to the city, or awarded to the city, I'm sorry, that took us from 6 per shift up to 8.
And when does that grant expire?
It expires in March of 2026.
Okay, so that's a separate discussion to the levy, but that is already expending itself. So we'll be back to pre-SAFER grant levels,
Yes.
which would be 6, but pre-levy level would take it to 5.
Yeah.
So it would be a drop of 3 firefighters per shift.
Or a total of 9 people or 1 full shift.
Okay, and that also doesn't take into account the growth of the city through the housing developments.
That's correct.
So this is the proposal if it does not pass? Is that what you're saying?
No, this is your proposal now. I'm just trying to quantify
But
how
I'm
many
just saying, you
people are.
talked about where would it go back to if it didn't pass? I went,
Yeah, if
Yeah, sorry.
unfortunately without the funding, we would basically have to go back to pre-levy.
Clarification only. I understand.
Yeah.
I just, because I think, I'm not sure people understand that.
Yeah.
And so I understand that your proposal is for fire, but I would like to go through the same exercise, if you don't mind, for the communications officer and the police officers. What did the pre-levy level look like for those 2?
So it was 2 less. So we're at 7 police officers, or sorry, 7 in the communications center. And we would be going down to 5, which includes the communications supervisor.
So over the course of a typical shift, how many police officers are on the road?
2.
That's now.
Mhm.
And you have 1 comms officer,
Yes.
and then you have 1 officer that is at the police department.
Mhm.
So typically 4 across
Mhm.
the board. Okay, so with, again, the failure of the safety levy, that's a whole separate discussion of loss of services there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so this is from our current staffing levels by ordinance for the fire department specifically. So we have 1 chief, 3 captains, 3 lieutenants, 12 firefighter EMTs, the SAFER grant positions, and then part-time 18 firefighters. On the right, you'll see whether it's filled or not, or at what level it's filled. We have 1 chief. We have a chief, Chief Thompson. We have 3 captains, 3 lieutenants. Of the 12 firefighter EMTs, we have 10 filled because we had 2 vacancies due to promotions. And then we have 6 staff who are filling positions by the SAFER grant,
And again, not separate discussion, but expires.
March of 26.
Okay.
So part-time firefighters, we have 0 positions filled for part-time firefighters. One of the things that we always hear when we're talking about the safety levy or about an income tax levy is, why can't we apply for grants? And so this is an example of grants that our fire department has received over the last 7 years. So you'll see On the far, when I'm looking at this screen, it's on my left. The AFG monies, you'll see 100,000 for SCBA equipment, $563,000 for a fire engine, 80,000 for an exhaust system, $928,000 for a ladder truck, $1.565 million for 6 personnel, for a total of 3.258. Now, what happens when you get grant is typically there's a city match that has to go along with it. So that's not all just money that goes into our pocket for us to spend as the city. So these are the matches that we have had to put forth in order to accept these grants. And so you'll see that in the SAFER line, I have 2 stars there. And I have 2 stars there because there are additional items in our contract that we pay for that aren't being funded by that amount of money. Does that make sense? Like their uniform and accessories and overtime is not paid for by the SAFER grant. So those are amounts that the city is paying. And I do have information for each of those individuals. And then lastly, for the ladder truck, you'll see we have a $494,000 investment through a loan that we are responsible for.
Even if you take out the SAFER grant, it's still nominal. I mean, the city match is literally like 4% or 3% or something very minor.
So my point with grants is twofold. One, we are applying for grants and we are being awarded them. But the second is we do typically have a city match, and all but one of those is for equipment, not personnel. And so with 70% of our total expenses for fire going to personnel, more of our grant dollars would have to equal the same percentage.
What is the asterisk by the ladder truck?
The asterisk by the ladder truck is the $464,000 loan that is not included in the city match portion. Okay, so we've mentioned SAFER grant a couple of times. So SAFER stands for Staffing for Adequate Fire and Emergency Response. This is a grant that was applied for by the fire chief and this previous one of the previous safety directors through FEMA. And that grant was in the amount of $1.565 million. The grant period of performance is from March 2023 to March 2026. Any additional levy funding would maintain these core positions beyond the grant period. Any questions? Okay, so why is point 4 for fire and EMS critical? And again, I apologize that these are pretty small up here on the screen, but you can see from 2019 to 2024, our call volume is increasing. In 2019, the fire department and EMS responded to 3,088 calls. In 2020, it was 3,516 calls. 2021, 3,981. 2022, 4,603, 2023, 4,605, and then last year, 4,853 runs. In addition to that, we have aging apparatus and equipment that needs to be replaced because we want our equipment when those guys go into a burning building to work properly. We want the equipment that they use to serve our citizens to work properly as well. We have staffing pressure amid growing demand with housing in the area. We do a lot of mutual aid runs as well with township fire departments that are surrounding us, with Pickaway Township and Deer Creek EMS and Pickaway. So without the funding, there's potential cuts to staffing and slower response times. That is what we would have to do without the funding. So what the 0.4 will fund: firefighter and EMS personnel wages and benefits, ambulance and fire apparatus purchase and maintenance, fire station upkeep and communications equipment. They use radios to talk to one another. And there's equipment in the fire department that allows them to do that and get dispatched and hear when they need a mutual aid call. And then training, rescue operations, and employer contributions. So why is the 0.1 for streets needed? In the previous proposals, we proposed, or it was proposed, 0.4. And so we heard in a service committee meeting earlier this year that we have a lot of streets that are needing to be repaired. We also hear from our citizens frequently that their street needs to be paved. In my State of the City earlier this year, I talked about the amount it costs to pave one street. And in my opinion, it was pretty astronomical what we paid per foot of or per mile of street within the city. And I actually don't have my notes. I just have my PowerPoint, but I can provide those for you. So many streets are deteriorated and require repair. We heard that our streets have been rated based on a system with our engineering firm Strand to look at our streets and see where the criticality of the repairs that are needed to that, in addition to the work that our utilities operations are doing. Those two things need to be matched up so that we're not tearing up a street that we're just going to tear up again. We're not paving a street that we're just going to tear up 6 months later to put in a water line or a sewer line. And so this provides needed support for street improvements. So we know that we personally and our citizens want safe and maintained roads to improve traffic safety and emergency access. Infrastructure upkeep maintains property values and quality of life. When people have roads that they're able to drive on, they're able to get from their house to the store, or they're able to get from their house to the hospital. They want streets that they're able to drive on and get there safely. So what's it going to fund? So it's going to fund resurfacing, reconstruction, and pothole repair, curb and gutter maintenance, preventative maintenance, such as crack sealing and drainage fixes, and matching funds for grants and larger projects. An example of a street grant that we have applied for is the Southport Street grade separation. $20 million to do that project, to be able to extend our road up and over the railroad so that people can get from downtown to our store area, our retail area on 23 South. And so we are also getting funding from OPWC. I talked to the service director today about the different grants that we get already for these types of repairs. So it's not that we are not applying for these grants, and it's not that we're not getting money from other places. We're bringing in revenue from other sources. The cost is going up just as much as it is, and the need is great. There are many projects that have been put on hold for years that we haven't attended to, that we are now having to attend to. Another one of those requirements are the requirements that come down from the state and or the federal government when it comes to water pipe replacement with PFAS and those types of things. The EPA has guidelines that we have to operate off of. And so some of these requirements that we're required to do are not simply us deciding to do them. They are mandates by the state and or federal government that we have to do this. And so these are This is just one way or a way that we can provide some funding for streets. Any questions so far? All right. So who pays the 0.5 income tax? So if you live and you work in Circleville, you would pay this additional 0.5 on top. You do not receive the 100% credit. If you live outside and you work in Circleville, you would pay the 0.5 income tax levy. And if you live in Circleville and you work outside, you will not pay the 0.5 and you receive a 100% credit on your Circleville municipal income tax.
So let me ask one question. I love this slide. This is one of my favorite slides in this whole deck. I wish that we would have added a third column that says who benefits from the 0.5. And the answer to that is every single person listed.
Mhm.
Because even if you fall into the last category where you live in Circleville and work outside and you don't actually pay the income tax because you're receiving the credit,
Mhm.
we don't ask that before we provide fire or safety services to your home.
Right.
So you still get those even though you don't pay for it.
Right. So the city of Circleville is a statutory city and we have a voter protected credit. And this is, we are a statutory city under the Ohio Revised Code. In May of 2014, Voter Initiative permanently protected the 100% credit for residents working outside the city. It was mentioned in a judicial committee that city council cannot reduce this credit without voter approval. And so there's no double taxation for people who live in the city but work outside. They're not paying they're not paying where they work and where they live.
And so that was kind of a last minute addition to this discussion, as we had previously discussed the potential of looking at that as a way to support this financial crisis that we're in.
Yep.
And then we found out that in the 2014 ordinance, it disallows.
In the 2014 ordinance, this was put on the ballot. So this was not a council initiated action like it previously had been done before. I believe in 2007, my memory serves me right, council did initially had the 50% credit. In the actual 14 language, the ordinance and the resolution to the Board of Elections, the commuter tax credit was placed on the ballot, therefore giving the people the opportunity to decide. That was also attached to the permanent tax levy.
Yeah.
So that is why that is no longer an option for council itself. It would have to go back to the voters.
Thank you.
And I do have those Board of Elections results if you're curious to know how that specific levy passed, income tax levy passed. So, accountability and transparency. For these funds, that would come in from this new income tax levy, they would be restricted to fire and EMS and street uses only through two separate funds, just like we've previously seen in the funds that we currently have set up right now. Those funds can only be used for those specific purposes. It's in our ordinance, and we are legally mandated to operate off of what our ordinance says. We have annual public reporting and audits that are done. We have an annual audit that is done by the city, done by the state every year. We provide annual reports every year from the auditor's office. And then at the bottom, city administration is committed to transparency of fiscal reports for all city revenue and expenses. And I specifically put in all, because even if people have questions now, we would be happy to provide expense and revenue reports, the ones that were referenced in today's report. So what happens without this levy? Funding ended on December 31st of 2024. Potential staff reductions or service cuts for fire and EMS, increased emergency response times, and accelerated street deterioration because we won't be able to continue to maintain them at the level that we have been. And I want to go back to specifically the staff reductions because we're solely talking about funding for fire and EMS. Without additional revenue for the city, additional staff members or positions could also have the potential of being reduced.
So I guess that's one question I would have. I think to speak to the elephant in the room. So again, you touched on it earlier, but we also had kind of in conjunction or within the same time frame of the levy, the SAFER grant, which was great and was an opportunity for us to enhance the fire department even more. That levy is coming to, or I'm sorry, that grant period is coming to a natural end. So, I think the average person might say, well, why can't we reapply? And why can't we potentially get that again? Which you might want to speak to that. But again, it's a grant. It's not a guarantee. There is a piece of this specific grant that requires us to keep them on staff, which obviously is a cost to the city as well. So I think it's important that when we talk about potential staff reductions, I know that that's not something that anybody wants to talk about, especially people that run for public office. But I don't personally see how it would be potential. If the levy doesn't pass, I don't know how we could potentially keep it staffed in the current level that it's staffed.
Yeah, we would not be able to keep staffing levels at the way that they are right now.
Okay. I mean, I just think it's important that people understand that it's not really a potential. It would absolutely have to happen based on not anyone's desire, but the feasibility of where would that money come from.
Right.
And then I think the interesting piece, which is to your last bullet point on this slide, could we come up with funding potentially, but it's not like we have excess funds. So what's going to get cut in lieu of that? And I think the streets are, which you'll probably speak to, but that's the obvious target of what would get cut. Nobody wants that either. So, it's obviously a lose-lose from the standpoint of a service that we do provide to the citizens.
So part of this exercise in the administration was for all departments to submit their 2026 budget to the administration for them to look at, knowing that the funds from the 2019 levy were not going to be coming in anymore. That included $1.2 million worth of streets and parks funding that would be cut in addition to positions.
Okay, so I think that's an important piece to capitalize on. So in the event, so essentially budgets were submitted under the attitude of this is what we have right now, which is no levy. And so with that potential in the 2026 budget, it cuts $1.2 million of street and park funds.
Yep.
Okay. That's not good for anybody.
No. And so that's why I included it in with the fire and EMS, because we know how much we spent on fire in 2024 at the levels that we are currently at. Now, we all know that we have debt obligations that we will pay off in the next couple of years, but those amounts are $25,000,
Right.
$50,000. They don't get to the level of 2.5. When you add them all together, they don't equal the necessary $2.5 million.
Right. And so and again, I understand that I'm summarizing this probably beyond what's due, but essentially with failure of a levy, whatever it looks like, it's about a $2.5 million gap to make up. And in the proposed, I'm going to say budget for 2026, which obviously isn't approved, but proposed, it cuts personnel and it cuts $1.2 million of streets.
Yeah. What is submitted to council will.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So timeline and next steps. I have this and two other slides. So the timeline and next steps, Finance Committee reviews tonight. The request is to forward with a recommendation. City Council vote scheduled for June 3rd and held for 3 readings. If passed, the levy would be submitted to the Pickaway County Board of Elections for ballot placement before August 5th. That is the deadline. So again, specifying tonight's request from me as the mayor, Finance Committee would forward the ordinance and resolution to City Council on June 3rd with the recommendation for passage. This would allow the voters to consider critical funding for fire, EMS, and street improvements starting on January 1 of 2026. And to recap, this is a renewing of, but not necessarily renewing of the 0.5 at the same rate with a clearer purpose, protecting public safety and maintaining infrastructure, and transparent, voter protected, and accountable.
Thank you. So I think that gives us a really good takeaway and summary of kind of the funds that we have, where they're spent, and then funds that would potentially be lost if we continue without some sort of levy support. So before I turn it over to questions, I am going to ask the safety director to speak on behalf of, obviously, you know, a little bit of your opinion so far as to where we stand. I know this is new to you in your current role, but you served us in a consultation purpose. So I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add, or if we could get some insight as to your opinion as to this proposal.
Yes, I think we've looked at this from like every which way from Thursday to try and figure this out. And when we do look at some of the things that has been mentioned here this evening about some of the increases on the fire and the calls for service, and what the folks here in the city of Circleville have now kind of they've become accustomed to. When you talk about the potential of losing firefighters in those kind of numbers, that's I don't know how they keep up. So, and then we talk about, and I think it was mentioned here also, the projected increases in housing that's kind of on the, you know, in the zoning folks are looking at all of those pieces that are coming and how fast they're coming. And if my numbers are right, and I'm not a mathematician, but 57% increase in calls for service since 2019 for the guys out at the fire and EMS, guys and gals at the fire and EMS. And so what does that look like with another 1,400 homes? And they're already increasing 57% without that increase in the homes. You know, what kind of signal does that send to the people who are not living here yet, but are going to be living here when they're looking for things like safety and security, right? Those are Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So they're looking at those, and we may find ourselves in a position where we lose 9 firefighters. And so is this funding critical? Absolutely, for the firefighters. Then you talk about, and I'm not the street guy, but you talk about the streets and the needs for those repairs too. $2.5 million, where do you come up with that when you're already kind of, or at least we feel like we're kind of strapped to begin with, and every dollar counts. And we're looking at those kind of reductions in funding, which equals, and 70%, I was kind of surprised at that, because in a prior life of mine, we ran about anywhere from 80 to 83% of our budget was people, was funding our people. And so 70% is actually pretty good. But still, there's all those other ancillary costs with equipment and training and everything else that goes with it. So is this important? It's absolutely critical to us, kind of supporting the services that we're becoming accustomed to and anticipating, you know, the increases that's going to come with additional housing and rooftops here in Circleville. So
Thank you.
okay.
So go ahead.
I'm sorry. I do have those figures from the state of the city. So there are between 75 and 80 miles of roadway throughout the city. Based on today's cost, the city spends approximately $110,000 to repave a quarter of a mile of road. For the same length of road, the city spends approximately $1.5 million to rebuild the road from the base to the driving surface. You have base repair, curb and sidewalk repair, actual road width, environmental issues, and other factors that can affect the numbers. But at 1.5 to rebuild the road from the base to the surface, that's a pretty hefty amount to repave a street when there's 75 to 80 miles of streets within the city limits.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to committee questions for anybody, and then we'll open it up to all of council, because I know several other council members are here. What questions do you have, sir?
Your rationale you explained about the fire, you explained about the streets. We haven't talked about police. Tell me about that.
I specifically, right now, our fire department has the higher number of people that are at risk. So funding their department is why I separated the two.
And similarly, in prioritization, had we passed the previous levy, that it got 0.25 instead of 0.4 of that 0.5 increase.
I don't know that we divided out how much each department would have.
Meaning it
got.
didn't necessarily divide out evenly.
Yeah, I don't know.
I guess my opinion is that I totally support the streets and I totally support the fire. I also understand that we are not in the black, if you will. We're not going to pay all our bills even if we pass this, okay? And just from Ward 4, streets and personnel, I personally would rather see a 0.25 streets and a 0.25 fire. And then we'll let the, we're going to have to make a decision somewhere of not everybody getting everything they want, okay? And I think the 0.1 for streets, if we want to pass this levy, is very, very, very low, in my opinion.
Can you expand on the comment? You said that even if this passes, we still wouldn't pay our bills.
I'm just saying that, do you really think, in other words, are you saying that if we pass a 0.4 for this fire, that they will be fully funded, fully staffed, and this will cover their expenses?
I think, and please, I think Paul or Michelle, if you want to chime into this, I think one of the things that we have struggled with as a council to understand is what fully funded means. In terms of what does fully staffed means, how many really is that? How many is it by ordinance? In my time on council, I'm not sure that we have ever staffed fire or police to ordinance. They are grossly under ordinance.
And that's my point.
But I think there's a difference between to ordinance and to a safe level, if that makes sense. I don't think, and again, I'm asking what your guys' feedback is on this, but it's like, I do feel like collectively the feeling is if this were to pass, we could get back into what we feel is a safe level of staffing to support the need for the city.
With a lot of other support from the city, is my point.
Which it always gets. I mean, she went through, I think, did a very good job of explaining the other funds.
But I'm just saying, we may pass this levy and still be laying people off next year in other departments. I hope we don't, okay? But I'm just saying, I've never seen us say that we have a comfortable level of income versus, or revenue versus expenses, if you will. And I'm just saying, we're putting a big hunk of this into the fire, okay? I'm questioning that, that's all.
Other comments or questions?
I'm done, thank you.
Questions or comments from anyone at council?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. One thing that, we saw recently that Pickaway County has denied construction in Commercial Point. And with all the construction that we have and all the requests that are coming in and so on, where do we draw the line? Because right now, if we can't take care of the future of Circleville, we can't build anymore. And we know, we've got a good thing going and we've had a good thing going, but we're saying we can only take care of what we have right now. How are we going to take care of any more? And, we pride ourselves on reaching out to folks and working with P3 and so on. But we have some concerns in the future if we continue to construct homes and more people coming in and we can't take care of almost what we have. That's a big concern. In itself. So, I like, obviously things have changed here. You used to be able to get across town and maybe a backup of 5 cars. Now it's steady traffic, even in my neighborhood, where there's all that new build and so on. But it's to a point, it's something we need to think about is, can we continue to open ourselves up for construction? And I'm I'm all for, developing the city and so on. I'm not negative about things, but we need to think about it as, what it'll take to take care of those 116 homes out there. And say approximately 4 people per home and so on. So there's something else that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, and I think your point's really valid, and I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we have as a city, because how do you balance, and I say this somewhat in jest, but honestly somewhat seriously, when you have people who constantly say we want a steakhouse, well, we've been told many, many times that in order to get a steakhouse or the like
Sure.
to this community, you need to add rooftops. And so to add rooftops, well, okay, great, that's what's going to attract these investors to come in, and I think that's all great, and if that's what people want, fine. But to your point, how do we sustain the services that we provide and that we have a responsibility to provide to the city?
Yeah, absolutely.
May I clarify a point? Commercial Point was water and sewage, okay?
We have that.
That's, I'd like to
We have
continue,
that.
if I may continue. We have twice the water, twice the sewage we need. We just put $38 million in probably a state-of-the-art plant. So therefore, I'm less concerned about the fire department, if you will, than our current status with water and sewage, which are excellent. And therefore, I'm not sure we need to stop building new construction because of a fire levy.
On the other side of it, though, is all of this traffic beats up our roads. Every time we add a new vehicle, a new truck comes through, whatever be the case, that's tearing up the streets, you know,
Amen, brother.
to say it. So all of that coming together, you know, there's no, I think, best solution in this whole situation, because one takes care of the other. It doesn't take care of the other either. So we've got a lot of things to consider. Certainly having, you know, the additional funds will help. But we know, I mean, the fire department is running all the time these days. I mean, considering what it used to be pretty quiet in the city, but it's not anymore. So the numbers, obviously from 2019 to 2025, have gone through the roof and so on. And we're still trying to take care of with monies basically equivalent to what we started with years ago. And so we need the money, period. But we've got a lot of things to consider.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other comments from other members of council in the audience?
You have presented the figures of what it costs to pay.
Yeah, can you come up to the podium just so everybody can hear it and for those viewing it?
You had presented what, you know, just a quarter of a street would cost. If you could present that of what it was before 2019, the cost of comparison, so people see the cost of concrete, that might be really helpful. The other is regarding the ordinance of the commuter tax, you know, from 2014, 2016. Is it possible that you can present a new vote for that, for the
So-
commuter tax, or?
I think the legal question becomes, is that's attached to a permanent levy. So do we have to undo the permanent levy?
Okay.
And so that is a legal argument that will have to be addressed. And so that's what makes this a little more difficult. It was not an independent item on the ballot. It was literally attached to the same paragraph, same issue. It was all one issue resolved in the ballot.
But even with that understanding of what might that figure look like as we grow and become more of a bedroom community of commuting, you know, I mean, that's something
So-
that people would be asking. I know you,
And I think that's the other issue, but the risk is that is our major source of funding right now. So I think that those are options that the city has been having, I think, in every aspect to try to figure out whether or not that is doable. But at this point in time, there's a lot of legal ramifications that have
I
to.
get that, yeah, and
You
so
got there.
thank you, yeah. Well, it was good research to find out. The other is, it was presented that we are only growing at a 2.5% here in this community, and without the new housing that's coming in, for people to need to paint out what it really would look like if we don't grow, how much of a greater tax burden, and even how much more services we would be cut without the growth. And I don't know if there's a way of presenting that, because we will even have fewer police and fire if we don't grow. So just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you. other comment? Oh, sorry, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on, John, go ahead.
Okay. What I want to know is, we just talked briefly on when it would, if we would pass it, when is it going to be funded? How long is it going to take to be funded? And then how are we going to cover that transition into the budgets moving forward? So-
Yeah, so historically, the levy fund has taken about 3 years, or the estimate is 3 years for a levy to be fully funded. Since we would be starting from scratch, there would be a little of a transition period.
Has that been accounted for? Do we know how we're going to cover that gap between, well, March for the SAFER grant, and then if it would, and then moving forward?
So based on, we haven't specifically put numbers to that, but we do know what the projected revenue would be over that period of time for this amount from RETA. And so we could put that into our revenue projections. The budget that I asked for from the administration was just expenses. It wasn't revenue, but there aren't really any additional revenue sources that we're bringing into the city.
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
I want to go back to the infrastructure, and thanks, Tom, for pointing this out. I think one of the issues that we saw in other communities was the infrastructure that you think of with water and sewer and roads. We have roads, albeit some have holes, some are in further disrepair than others, but we do have water and sewer capacity to withstand the addition of housing. That is one of the first things that we talk about when we talk about a housing development, is what are those utilities, what is the reach of the utilities? How does it get there? What is even the flow of that? Because pressure has to be considered too. So Jim and Brian are considered and consulted with when we look at these housing developments. When we look at housing developments, we do look at other infrastructure, schools, and safety forces. We use projections that are provided to us by people who do this for a living. They work with these developers. They work in the economic development space to project how much revenue would be brought into the hospital and the restaurants and all of the other ancillary services of revenue that would be brought to this community when we consider these housing developments. And one of those, and it's a fair point, is to consider safety forces. And I think up until this point, part of that conversation has been the commuter tax, because we know that a portion of these people who are going to be coming and living in these houses are going to be working outside of the city. But not everybody will necessarily have to work outside of the city. So there will be a portion of that, the income from these houses, that will stay here. And we could see. Now, I don't know how to project that, and I will ask for those numbers to try to project what that income is. If a percentage of those people work and live here, for that income tax specifically. But Hannah, you're here tonight as our city planner. If you want to talk about some of the conversations that we've had specifically surrounding housing and what that looks like as we consider the budget.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that we've been working on a lot to absorb the impact of all the new developments coming is the NCA. So we will be bringing in additional revenue strictly from the new houses that are coming in through that. That's the 8 mills that's going to go on the property taxes for all new houses. It will not all come at once. That pretty much is going to go on once the house is built and sold. But that will build up over time to help support the new houses. But I think it's important to have this levy now to kind of make up for the shortfalls that we have right now. And then the NCA can help support new development moving forward.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've got a crisis in the meantime, though.
Michelle, just to pick up on one of your points, I was really impressed when Jim gave a presentation of all the engineering work. We know what streets are what, when to fix them, how soon, criticality. We also have 0.4 is a permanent street levy. So with only 0.1, and you see how the critical nature of our streets are now, and we're going to add 25% more to what we're currently using, it's going to be insignificant, I fear.
I think the important thing to remember, though, is I hear what you're saying, and I think your point is valid. I think it's very important, though, that people hear that in the absence of a safety levy, as she has proposed it, which doesn't have to be as it happens, but as she has proposed it, in the absence of that passing, it's a $1.2 million cut.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I totally support, if you hear anything other than that, I totally support putting levy on the ballot. Okay.
Other comments, questions from anyone in the audience, council, anybody else? Okay, so to recap the ask tonight, there are two pieces of legislation on the actual agenda. One is a resolution, one is an ordinance. I'm going to let the law director speak to what both of those are. But the ask is that we pass this through this committee with the recommendation for passage, that it would then go to council as a whole, where it would ultimately be passed or not passed, decided on by the whole council group. The concern is obviously at this point, the timing behind it. I think we're all in agreement, council as a whole, that if a levy were to happen, regardless of what it looks like, it needs to be happening quickly. If the assumption is that it would go on the November ballot. So that is the ask tonight. Kendra, do you mind speaking to the difference between the resolution and the ordinance?
So these are counterintuitive, I think, because normally when we think of a resolution, it's short term, and normally an ordinance, we think it's longer. So they're actually in reverse. So the ordinance is your power and authority to submit the levy to the electors. Under Ohio Revised Code, that lies solely within the municipality's powers to do so. So with that being said, the ordinance needs to be read and determined first. And then what that ordinance does is if it's passed, then it directs council to pass a resolution to be submitted to the Board of Elections for placement on the ballot. So as you will see, when you go through the ordinance, there's multiple things that needed to be addressed. Obviously, this is an increase from the permanent levy that has been on through the 1988 and then the one that started in 2015 that passed in 2014 that got us to the 2%. Obviously, then in 2019, that levy has fallen off the books. So this section is amending some of the things that the 19 section amended, i.e. the allocation of how the tax levy is spent. And then on further, then it goes to add and to amend section 192 of the codified ordinances, which deal with the permanent levies as they stand now. So then essentially that'll give the breakout. Now, I will tell you it's wordy. And the reason it's wordy is there are specific things that we can hold a levy for. And specifically, it's very generic when it comes to streets, but it is very detail oriented when it comes to a fire or an EMS levy that outlines everything that can be spent on. So when you see all of that language, don't get all tied up. A lot of that is pursuant to the Ohio Revised Code. So then essentially, if the ordinance passes in its form, it is reflective of what the mayor is asking for. So essentially that would be of that 2.5%, the additional 0.5%, 0.4 would be allocated to fire, and then the 0.1 to the streets. And then once that would hit council floor and be accepted, then there is a resolution directing the Board of Elections to place this on the ballot with the ballot language. Just as let's review, I have in a draft form submitted that ballot language to the Board of Elections just to make sure that there are no tie-ups on our end if they're not in agreement with the language. Obviously, this is still conditioned on this being passed and the formal resolution being presented to the Board of Elections. But I want everybody to know that there's also a side step to make sure that they are in approval of that language as suggested by the Ohio Revised Code.
Thank you. So before we ask Melissa to read both of these, I do want to recap that even if this were to get moved forward from our committee to council, it doesn't necessarily mean it passes. It would give out council as a whole the opportunity to vote on it and to discuss it. We did advertise that this meeting was happening quite a while ago, so we gave everyone the opportunity to come so we could participate in the discussion. we had Jeff who had a prior commitment, and then our other council person did come in at the end. So all of council is here with the exception of Jeff, and I know Sherry missed some of it, but we have had the opportunity to talk about it. In the event that this moves forward to council and this would be held for its first reading next Tuesday, obviously it would give council the option to have a larger discussion if things were not said today or we didn't have the opportunity to say what they wanted to. I assume if there are questions that anybody has prior to the meeting, we'd like those submitted so we could all come prepared on Tuesday.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Any other questions, comments before we ask Melissa to read?
Yeah, I have a question for the law director.
Yes, sir.
We do not have quorum if I don't support this. I do not support the 4 and the 10% and 40%. Can we just simply say for safety, for the fire department and for the streets, taking the percentages out? That way we can discuss it at council and I can, with good conscience, put it forward to council.
One good question, one clarifying question though. We had a finance committee where we actually had no participants come outside of myself, and I was able to move it forward as the chair. Is that possible or no? Because I was surprised by that when it happened.
Yeah.
So good question. I don't know.
Unfortunately, my vote will negate yours.
At this point,
I would like to move it forward, okay? I really would. But I want to move it forward with good conscience from me.
at this point, I think it was factually different when you were the only one. There are 2 people here.
Yeah.
So I think that is going to pose the problem.
Okay. So let's read it, knowing how it's going to go, and we will, sounds like not moving
You're
forward.
saying we really can't adjust that?
I'm not saying we can't. I guess that's the other thing. And if I'm being instructed to create another ordinance for council consideration.
We could just put an amendment on it to say we'd like to keep those 2.
Sorry, clarify. What are you saying? You don't.
I'm
you're not
suggesting
making-
we have in the past, when an ordinance needed fixed, we could do an amendment to it.
Correct, but I
restate it.
need to know what's being proposed. So is there a counter proposal?
I'm suggesting that we simply do not put percentages there, but rather we want to support with this levy, the police department and the streets.
You want the police instead of the fire?
I'm so sorry. I'm not having a good night. The fire,
Okay.
EMS, everything. I thought you did a very nice presentation. Thank you for all the work you've done. I totally support it. I just would like to change the percentages. Or
All
at
right,
least
so
give us
here's-
the opportunity.
Here's
to
what
do
I
that.
would propose. We can present this to council floor. I can do a second copy with the percentages blank to address formally on council floor. I don't like sending that's way open-ended for me, if that makes sense.
Can't we go with me on this?
Sure.
Can't we make a recommendation to move it forward as it's written and it get changed on council floor?
It can.
But I can't support it. Sure.
Well, let's go ahead and read it, Melissa. If you could read A for us.
So you're saying you're not comfortable with leaving those
Let me
those
just
blanks, as you're saying, Law Director?
She said ordinance needs to go first.
Well, hold on. Sorry, go ahead.
You're saying you are not comfortable putting the second ordinance in front of council with the blanks? Did I?
No, I would rather, if that's the case, then I want, you guys don't have to vote for passage. You can send it to council floor for further evaluation. Does that make sense? We don't always have a recommendation for passage. So the question becomes, you can send it to council floor for further evaluation. I can ancillary, if you authorize and vote on it now, I can also send a blank percentage to council floor to be filled in and addressed by council.
But we would do that through the exercise of voting.
Correct. You would have to move to amend that to physically put those in on council floor, and it would take that full vote.
So the amendment would happen on council floor.
And what is the percentage of vote that would have to pass because it has an emergency?
Well,
It's got an emergency clause, but best practice is 3 readings.
3 readings, yeah.
So you need 4 of the 7.
4 out of 7.
It's, well, no, I believe it's 2/3. It's
Okay.
2/3 vote.
I'm sorry, we were talking.
It's 2/3 vote.
You would need 2/3 votes, so you need 5.
Okay. Thank you.
It's for passage in general.
Okay, so let's read it. Melissa, do you want to read? We're going to start with B, which is the ordinance piece, and then we're going to do A.
An ordinance of the city of Circleville so as to increase the city income tax rate from the current rate of 2% to a rate 2.5% to become effective January 1st, 2026, with 1/10% of the increase to be allocated for the purpose of general construction, reconstruction, resurfacing, and repair of the streets, roads, and bridges necessary in the city of Circleville, and 0.4% to be allocated for the purpose of providing and maintaining fire apparatus, mechanical resurrectors, underwater rescue and recovery equipment, or other fire equipment and appliances, buildings and sites, therefore, or sources of water supply and materials, therefore, for the establishment and maintenance of lines of fire alarm, communications for the payment of firefighting companies or permanent part-time or volunteer firefighting emergency medical services, including the payment of any employer contributions required for such personnel under section 145.48 or 742.34 of the revised code, for the purchase of ambulance equipment, for the provisions of ambulances, paramedic, or other emergency medical services operated by a fire department or firefighting company, or for the payments of other related costs, to direct the Pickaway County Board of Elections to submit this ordinance to the electors of the city and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Melissa. So we've heard the ordinance piece of this, and it would go to council for review on June 3rd, which is a week from this evening. Is there a motion?
With clarification. So you will have a presentation to council with blanks, Kendra?
If you are directing me in an ancillary to provide a blank ordinance with the blank percentages, but it still says the same language, we're just changing
Numbers.
the allocation. We're still dealing with a 0.5, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I'm asking. If it's just the allocation of the 0.5, then yes, I think that can be adjusted on council floor.
And then from the chairman of this committee, we could explain the fact that we're casting it through for us to discuss, not necessarily recommending these numbers. Are you comfortable with that?
I'm comfortable with that clarification because I'm not in agreement with your suggestions. So I'm fine to make it blank and to have it further discussed with the whole group.
Perfect.
Okay. So you made a motion to move it forward. I will second that. Can we please do a roll call?
Hedges,
Yes,
Duval.
Yes.
thank you. All right, and now can we read what was A on the agenda?
A resolution to submit to the electors at the primary election to be held on the 4th day of November 2025, an ordinance to increase the city income tax rate from the current rate of 2% to a rate of 2.5% to become effective January 1st, 2026 by allocating 0.1% of the increase for the purpose of general construction, reconstruction, resurfacing, and repair of the streets and roads and bridges necessary in the city of Circleville, and allocating 0.4% for the purpose of providing and maintaining fire apparatus, mechanical resurrectors, underwater rescue and recovery equipment, or other fire equipment and appliances, buildings and sites therefore, or sources of water supply and materials therefore, for the establishment and maintaining of lines of fire alarm communications, for the payment of firefighting companies or permanent, part-time, or volunteer firefighting, emergency medical service, administrative, or communications personnel, to operate the same, including the payment of any employer contribution required for such personnel under section 145.48 or 742.34 of the revised code, for the purchase of ambulance equipment, for the provision of ambulance, paramedic, or other emergency medical services operated by a fire department or firefighting company, or for the payment of other related costs, to direct the Pickaway County Board of Elections to submit this tax ordinance to the electors of the city and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, ma'am. So that is the resolution portion of this. Is there a recommendation with alteration?
Sure.
So,
I so move.
so moved by Tom Duval for the same change to make basically the percentages blank, to move forward for council on June 3rd for further consideration. Motioned by Tom Duval, second. Please do a roll call.
Hedges,
Yes.
Duval.
Yes.
Thank you. So that concludes the agenda portion of our, the action item of our agenda this evening. To reiterate, this will go to council for further discussion next Tuesday, June 3rd. I would ask and challenge all council members, if you have questions, comments, need further information prior to council, please give adequate time for that information to be gathered. And also just keep in mind that obviously this is a big discussion and a big decision that we have to make. I would also challenge all council members, if you don't support the levy as it's written, please come with another idea because we are running short on time. That is all. We have housekeeping items that was left on here as a whole placeholder for the auditor who's not here. So I assume there's nothing to be discussed in that regard. Any old or other business?
Then,
If not, is there a motion to
so
adjourn?
moved.
Moved by Tom Duval. We are adjourned at 7:15. Thank you very much.